It began on a Tuesday, a day nobody marks or remembers, yet the kind of day fate seems to choose for its mischief, when Theo missed his usual tram and decided, on impulse more than logic, to walk through the older part of town, the one with crooked alleys, cafes with uneven chairs, and bookstores that smelled of cloves and mildew. His campus was still 3 stops away, but something about the mist rolling down from the rooftops made him curious, made him pause near a cafe window fogged with laughter and the clink of cutlery, where behind the glass, he saw her, not beautiful by the standards he was used to, but alive in a way that startled him. Her hair was pinned up messily, a few streaks of silver glinting like rebellion, and she was arguing with the waiter in what sounded like fluent French, laughing at her own mispronunciations, waving her hands with a freedom that felt earned. She wore a wool coat buttoned wrong, one boot unlaced, and yet carried herself with the kind of presence that made people move around her without realizing they were doing it. She was at least twice his age, perhaps more, yet Theo stood there like a fool, watching her sip her coffee and frown at a notebook that looked older than him. His distraction didn't last long. Inside, she noticed him through the fogged glass, their eyes met, and instead of embarrassment or dismissal, she raised one eyebrow in a question, "Well?" Theo, embarrassed but emboldened, stepped into the café. It was one of those absurd, impulsive decisions that tend to shape a life without asking permission. He ordered a coffee he didn't want, sat 2 tables away, pretended to read a book he hadn't opened in weeks. She returned to her notebook, but not before giving him the ghost of a smile, not flirtatious, not inviting, but something rarer, amused recognition. What came next wasn't conversation, not yet. It was a week of glances, always in that same cafe. Theo started leaving campus earlier just to walk by and see if she was there, and somehow, she always was, around the same time, always with her notebook and the same chipped coffee cup. One day, the barista got his order wrong and gave him mint tea instead of espresso. He made a face, and across the room, she laughed, not politely, but with full, unrestrained delight, the kind of laugh that cuts through years of guarded silence. Later that afternoon, as he passed by her table with his drink, she spoke to him without looking up. "You made a face like someone had betrayed your ancestors." "It was only tea." Theo paused, heart thudding at the sound of her voice, low, smoky, amused. "I wasn't ready for mint. It's an ambush, not a flavor." That made her glance up, and something in her face softened, not exactly fondness, but interest with a hint of cautious warmth. "You're not from here," she said. "Depends on what you mean by here." "This town," she said, "is very bad at keeping secrets. You would have heard about me already." He didn't answer, and she didn't push. But the smile she gave him, quick, uncertain, real, was the first honest one she had offered anyone in years, and they both knew it. Her name, he would learn a week later, was Mira. She had once been a writer, or perhaps still was, depending on how one measured such things. Theo had seen her books in second-hand shops but hadn't connected them to her. She never mentioned them. He never asked. Their conversations remained brief, elliptical, rooted in shared observations of the city's absurd rituals, the way old men fed pigeons with surgical precision, how the mayor's statue looked perpetually annoyed, how the river seemed to whisper gossip if you stood by it long enough. One afternoon, when Theo brought 2 coffees and left one at her table without asking, she looked at him for a long, silent moment before saying, "You know I'm older than your mother, don't you?" Theo sipped his coffee and said, not looking at her, "Then maybe I'll finally meet someone who actually understands Chopin." The smile returned. Less ghost now, more flesh. The city had its own rhythms, but small towns nested inside it like seeds, each with its own languages, codes, suspicions. Theo's university campus was one such place, a polished stone of prestige and pedigree where deviation raised eyebrows and gossip thrived like moss in shaded corners. His friends, a rotating cast of opinionated cynics and idealists, knew only fragments about his sudden disappearance every afternoon. At first, they teased him, another girl, another escape, but Theo dodged their jokes with half-truths and silence. He didn't yet know why he kept Mira a secret, only that to name her would make her less. Mira, for her part, never asked what he told others. But she'd begun walking with him after the cafe closed, long walks down the riverbank or through alleys lined with lilac in disrepair. Their conversations, once sarcastic, grew intimate in tone without ever naming it, shared stories, fragments of confession, moments that opened like soft bruises. She told him her ex-husband had once publicly accused her of plagiarizing her second novel, a lie that nearly destroyed her. She had survived the scandal but not the aftermath. Publishers withdrew, friends fled, her own words began to taste like rust. Theo told her about his father's long silences and the way his mother wore disappointment like perfume. He had come to university hoping to escape the predictability of their shame. Mira nodded, not in pity but recognition. Still, despite their candor, an edge remained, some unspoken understanding that what existed between them was suspended above a chasm they dared not name. Then came the letter. It arrived folded in quarters, no return address, slipped under the cover of Myra's notebook while she had stepped away. She found it after Theo had gone, and when she read the words, her breath caught in her throat, not from surprise but inevitability. He is seen. The boy is known. This is not Paris. People talk. No name. Just that. A threat, or a warning. Mira burned the note in her sink, flushed the ashes, told no one. But she began arriving later to the café. She spoke more carefully, eyes scanning reflections in windows. And Theo, perceptive despite his youth, felt the shift immediately. Something's wrong, he said one evening as they stood in the shadow of a church, the bells marking time like judgment. You imagine things, Mira replied too quickly, her hand tight around the cigarette she hadn't lit. Tell me who hurt you, he said, a question disguised as a command. Everyone I trusted, she answered, her voice raw. But don't flatter yourself. You're too young to be dangerous. Maybe I'm just old enough to not care what they think. She flinched, not at the words, but at how much she wanted to believe them. A few days later, Theo heard the first whisper on campus. He was at the library when two students behind him, philosophy majors, smug and venomous, laughed about the kid with the old lover. The phrase stung not because it was crude, but because it existed at all. He confronted Mira about it, not with anger, but concern. You said people talk, he said. They're starting to. They always were, she said, tired. They just found their words now. She touched his hand for the first time that night, not romantically, not seductively, but like someone anchoring herself to something real. Theo didn't pull away. But both knew that the silence around them was thinning, the way ice does just before it cracks underfoot. The first time Theo called her after midnight, his voice was hesitant, wrapped in the quiet of his dorm room like a confession in a cathedral. Mira didn't answer at first. When she finally picked up, her voice was groggy, irritated, but not cold. It's late, she said, though not like someone who wanted to hang up. I couldn't sleep, he murmured. And I kept thinking about you. About us. There was a pause. She didn't laugh, didn't deflect. Instead, she said, you shouldn't use the word us so lightly. I wasn't, he replied. It began like that, one night, then another. Conversations stretching between two rooms lit by different shadows, touching things they couldn't say in daylight. They didn't talk about love, not exactly, but they spoke about being seen, about how people become invisible in different ways. She told him about how silence had crept into her bones, how she had gone years without anyone genuinely asking her how she was and waiting for the real answer. He told her about how everything in his life felt rehearsed until he met her. I used to feel like I was always imitating someone older, someone who knew what they were doing, he said one night. But with you, I stopped pretending. I live. I hate that I understand exactly what you mean, she whispered back. Because I do. And I haven't felt that way in a decade. She began to write again. Just fragments, but Theo noticed the change, the sharper glint in her eyes, the way her voice lingered on ideas, turning them over like stones. They started meeting at night, not just in the café but in hidden corners of the city, behind the opera house, in the alley beside the conservatory, on the benches near the cemetery gates where no one ever looked. They weren't foolish enough to kiss in public, but sometimes, when no one was watching, their hands would find each other like magnets beneath a table. But someone was watching. It happened on a Thursday. A violin student named Mathis, sharp-nosed and always listening, saw them as he exited the conservatory late. Mira and Theo stood in shadow, not touching, but close enough for anyone to guess the truth. Mathis froze, blinked, and said nothing. They didn't even notice him. But the next morning, whispers were louder.
Myra's name, long faded from relevance on campus, returned like a ghost. That writer who used to be something. She's seeing a student. No, not a student, a boy.
And Theo, once an anonymous name in lecture halls, now walked through corridors under the weight of staring eyes.
That night, he didn't call Mira. She called him.
Her voice was steady but quieter than usual.
They know, she said. Someone saw us. I don't care. I do.
Because you're scared?
No. Because I remember what happens next. She didn't hang up.
They stayed on the line for hours without talking, just the sound of each other's breath echoing in the dark.
2 days later, someone slipped a photo under Myra's cafe table.
It showed her and Theo leaving the alley behind the opera house, their shadows long, unmistakable.
On the back, in pencil. Not art. Just foolishness. She didn't show Theo the picture. She didn't have to. When they met the next time, she didn't speak.
She just looked at him for a long time, then said,
"If this is the end, I want it to be ours, not theirs."
Theo said nothing, just reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't pull away.
The walls were closing in. The secret was growing teeth.
But in the small hours of the night, when the world was silent and every barrier dissolved, they felt more alive than ever before. The unraveling didn't begin with a bang, but with a question, one that came not from a stranger, not from an enemy, but from someone close enough to break something delicate just by asking. Theo had a sister, Ava, only 2 years older, sharper than him in speech and far more attuned to the vibrations of truth beneath silence. She had noticed the change in him, the quiet intensity, the sudden evasions, the way he vanished in the afternoons and came back looking like he'd been somewhere far deeper than the local café. When she finally cornered him in the campus garden, she didn't accuse him. She simply asked, "Who is she?" And Theo, perhaps out of exhaustion, perhaps out of a desperate need to say her name aloud, answered, "Mira."
Ava didn't react right away.
She stared at him for a long time, her eyes narrowing, not in judgment, but in calculation. "The Mira Durrell?" she asked.
"The one who used to lecture here? The one who vanished after the scandal?" "She didn't vanish," Theo said quietly. "She survived." Ava exhaled through her nose. "You're serious?" "I've never been more." "Do you understand what they'll do to her if this gets out?" "They already know. They're already whispering." "That's not the same as headlines," Ava said. "And headlines will come."
That conversation didn't end in a fight, but in an uneasy stalemate.
Ava didn't promise silence. Theo didn't ask her to.
But the damage, small as it seemed, was done. The next week brought the conference, the annual citywide symposium on literature, hosted at the university, open to students, professors, critics, and alumni. Mira had been invited weeks ago, before anything began, before anyone looked too closely. Her name had been printed on every flyer. She was scheduled to speak on the final panel, the role of scandal in artistic legitimacy. Theo had planned to attend anonymously, quietly, to sit at the back and listen to her reclaim the stage. Instead, he arrived to a sea of eyes already watching him.
Someone had told. Maybe Ava. Maybe Mathis.
Maybe someone anonymous who had followed too many breadcrumbs.
It didn't matter.
What mattered was that when Mira took the stage, dressed in charcoal gray, eyes sharp, notes trembling slightly in her hand, she faced not an audience but a firing squad. The panel opened with stiff questions.
Polite applause. Thin smiles.
Then someone stood, a faculty member, older, known for his merciless commentary, and asked, point blank,
"Do you believe an artist can separate their personal conduct from their work? And should students be expected to?" The room held its breath. Mira didn't blink.
She leaned forward and said, "That's a question loaded with implication.
So I'll answer it plainly. What I've written stands on its own. But if we're going to talk about conduct, let's be honest about who gets to judge, and why."
The moderator cleared her throat.
"Ms. Durrell." But Mira raised a hand and kept speaking. "There's been speculation. About my relationship with someone younger.
Let me clarify it now, in full view of everyone who's dared to whisper, yes, it's true.
The air went dead. Not a gasp. Not a sound.
I am seeing someone who is not my age, not my peer, not my equal by the standards most of you hold dear.
But he is honest. He listens. He asks real questions.
And he sees me not as a relic, not as a broken writer, but as a person worth knowing.
That's more than I can say for most of this room.
From the crowd, Theo stood.
Slowly. Quietly. All eyes turned.
Some in disbelief, some in triumph, some in quiet horror.
He said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence answered every question.
The applause, when it came, was uneven.
Polite from some. Reluctant from most. But it came.
Afterward, backstage, Mira collapsed into a chair and covered her face with both hands.
That was suicide, she muttered.
That, Theo said, kneeling in front of her, was a beginning. No, she said, eyes wet but defiant.
That was the end of everything safe. They didn't kiss. Not then. Not with the walls listening and futures hanging in balance.
But they looked at each other, truly looked, and for the first time, there was no fear left between them.
Only clarity.
The world didn't collapse after the conference, though it did tilt just enough to throw off balance the fragile things they had built in private.
Mira lost a scheduled publishing meeting 2 days later.
A few professors withdrew their support for her continued presence at campus events.
Invitations dried up like spilled ink under the sun.
For Theo, the impact was quieter but no less cutting. Friends who once called him fearless now called him reckless. His mentor in the philosophy department, who had promised to nominate him for an academic residency, politely postponed their meeting. Ava barely spoke to him except to say, "I warned you," with a sadness that tasted more like betrayal than concern. They continued seeing each other, but the city felt different now, heavier.
Eyes followed them. Conversations paused when they entered a room. Their story was no longer theirs.
It had been consumed, reframed, recited without nuance.
She was a woman who should have known better.
He was a boy playing grown-up.
The myths wrote themselves.
One evening, weeks after the conference, they met in Myra's apartment, the one with the peeling wallpaper and antique typewriter, where their laughter once echoed freely. This time, the air was still. Mira sat by the window, smoking a cigarette she didn't seem to enjoy. Theo paced slowly, a book in his hand that he hadn't opened.
"I'm tired," she said without looking at him. "Of me? Of this. Of being seen like a scandal and never like a woman again." Theo didn't reply right away.
He walked to the edge of the room, looked at her reflection in the glass, aged, yes, but proud, clear, stubbornly human.
"Then let's leave," he said. "Not forever. Just somewhere they don't know us. You think the world stops whispering just because you change zip codes? No. But maybe it whispers in another language."
She smiled, small, wounded.
"You still believe that love can outrun consequences. And you've decided love can't outrun fear."
"No," she said, turning to face him.
"I just learned that sometimes it shouldn't have to try."
They spent that night together, without drama or declarations, just touch and silence and something deeper than both. In the morning, she made coffee the way he liked, and when he left, she kissed him like someone writing the last line of a poem.
They didn't break up. They didn't fight. But after that night, something shifted. The meetings became less frequent.
The calls shorter. Each one still filled with meaning, but punctuated by pauses neither of them tried to explain. 3 months later, Theo sat on a train headed for a fellowship abroad, one he had nearly lost but eventually reclaimed through sheer grit. He stared out at the passing countryside, her name tucked behind every thought but unspoken. In his bag was a letter. Mira had mailed it 2 days before his departure.
No return address. No promises. "Theo. We told the truth. We held nothing back. And that means we get to walk away with our heads high, no matter what they say. You changed the way I see myself. And no matter where you go next, I hope the world looks different for you now, too. Not all love survives. But not all of it has to die, either. M. He folded the letter and held it to his chest. Outside, the fields blurred into green and gold. A child in the seat behind him giggled. An old woman hummed a song no one recognized. And somewhere in a small city that kept too many secrets, a woman sat at a typewriter, writing again. The final sentence of her new book would ask a question, one that neither condemned nor forgave, but simply lingered, like a breath in winter air. If we are judged only by the way we love, who among us would dare to love at all?